From the local to the global stage, the climate crisis has become an encompassing issue. The proposed Bradford Bypass, with its hefty potential price tag of $4 billion, raises concerns about its potential harm to Lake Simcoe. This project could significantly affect the health of residents, particularly young children and infants, due to possible air and water pollution. And a recent report from Ontario's Attorney General on the Ford government's actions revealed that the decision making process to allocate protected greenbelt land for housing was predominantly influenced by a select group of well connected developers. These developers stand to earn billions of dollars from its venture. These findings highlight profound concerns within our political system, especially as the climate crisis intensifies. So, what can concerned residents do to ensure the health and well being of themselves, their families, loved ones, neighbors, and their children? We spoke to Margaret Prophet, the Executive Director of Simcoe County Greenbelt Coalition, to delve deeper into this matter. Thank you so much for joining me today, Margaret. I, as I'm looking at climate change and environmental issues, there are issues starting from the local level, provincial, national, and international. At the local level, we have Bradford Bypass. At provincial, the Attorney General's report on green belts in Ontario. We have wildfires raging from east to west. And at international level, we have flooding in India, record temperatures in Arizona, and wildfires in Hawaii. Mm-hmm. So now it seems like the problem has come, full circle, the climate change and the environment. So I would like to start with the Bradford bypass and the recent public meetings that your group conducted. So can you just talk a little bit about those meetings and what are the concerns, environmental concerns?
Regarding the Bradford bypass, planned along the route of the bypass. So the bypass goes from the Highway 400 to the Highway 404, cuts through the heart of the Holland Marsh, just a few kilometers south of Lake Simcoe. And so those town hall meetings were in lieu of public consultation process that never happened under the provincial ministries. The major concerns that we had was, one, the increasing cost of this highway. Now could be anywhere up to $4 billion, working out to $250 million per kilometer of this highway, because it's only 16 kilometers long. That was one of the major concerns. Two, there was concerns about Lake Simcoe. As I mentioned, it's very close to the lake. It also cuts through one of the major wetlands, which is the Holland Marsh wetland. And it's at the headwaters of Lake Simcoe, meaning whatever goes into those waters flows into Lake Simcoe. And then third, the Ministry of Transportation's own study showed that there would be contamination of groundwater and private wells, as well as increased air pollution. So we wanted to let people know that the side effects of the highway that haven't been talked about because they're not very favorable for the highway need to be talked about, and we wanted the public to be aware.
And so in terms of what has been done, so the first question is what has been done by the provincial government in terms of doing this study, and as well as how far the highway has progressed. Is it 10% complete, 20% complete? So what people can do at this stage, and that the government will respond.
Well, first off, what's important to know is that it's 0% complete. In fact, the highway isn't slated even to be operational until sometime into the 2030s. So we have close to a decade or more before there's going to be anybody potentially traveling on this highway. As far as the studies, they're relying a lot on studies that were done in 1998. So we're now talking another century, a few decades ago. And because the studies were so out of date, they've actually exempted themselves from a full EA process that would be updated. So they have quote unquote streamlined this environmental assessment process. But what that has meant is that it's cut corners on the types of studies, the depth of the studies, the threshold that they have to pass in order to have satisfactory results. So they kind of made a mockery of the environmental assessment process. And Gord Miller, who was the former environmental commissioner of Ontario, became familiar with this case and said basically that they have done this in contempt of the Ontarian public, and that this is exact opposite of way these types of projects should be done, which is you complete all of the studies, make sure they're fully robust, and study all the issues before you consider any design issues. And that's not what's happening here.
So the decision-making process for this highway seems very similar to the opening of the green belts, parts of the green belt that the report came out billions of dollars in benefit to the developers. But before going to that, I just wanted to understand. So you on your website, there are letters. I believe you have sent letters. You have sent letters to municipalities. Is that including Barrie and surrounding municipalities?
Yes, it's gone to all of the Lake Simcoe watershed municipalities, as well as other municipalities that stood up against the bypass before, which there were 7 municipalities in the region that said that the studies that were proposed then were not good enough and they wanted to have them fully done. The province virtually ignored all of that municipal feedback, and now they're trying to ram this through.
So can you just list which are these municipalities?
Barrie was one of them. Agilitas, Orontios, I think Aurelia was another. There was a motion put forward by Bradford West Gwillimbury that said that they wanted the full studies done, and I think a motion by Georgina. And I know I'm missing a couple, but that's what I have off the top of my head.
So have you received any kind of response from the for example, Barrie Council, Barrie City regarding this?
Not regarding the letter yet, no. We have had some councils that have received it and have made supporting motions already, but I have not heard from Barrie yet.
So what is your expectations in terms of from the city? What they can do, because this is the provincial matter after all. So what the city of Barrie and council can do?
Well, since Barrie is the largest city that's based on Lake Simcoe, they have an obligation not only to the people that reside in Barrie, but as stewards of the watershed, as members of the Lake Simcoe region, and also to their own economy, to ensure that the lake stays healthy. And it used to be that municipalities, and it's still this way in some places, governments get used to the little lines we draw. This is Barrie, this is Aurelia, this is Innisfil, and we keep our business straight and you keep your business straight. But unfortunately, water and natural heritage and climate and flooding don't really care what the municipal boundaries are. So impacts to the lake don't just come from Barrie, and they're not controlled just by Barrie. However, being a very influential city on the lake that depends on the lake for a lot of tourism, for their waterfront, for a lot of festivals, their economy, a lot of it is based on the idea that Barrie is a wonderful place to live, work, and play. And so I would think that from a Barrie Council perspective, they should be using their influence to make sure that this process is well thought through and that the impacts to Lake Simcoe have been thought of. And the fact of the matter is, Lake Simcoe has not been studied as far as the impacts from this highway about what will happen with the additional phosphorus and salt. And already we're seeing within 30 years that the lake will become toxic with salt. That's not including what's going to happen with Bradford Bypass. So we're on a bit of a time here where we're counting down on how much longer we can have a positive impact on the lake before the ecology of the lake kind of runs off in a direction that we can't help anymore. And I don't think anybody wants to see that happen with Lake Simcoe. So at the very least, we would expect the city council to use its influence to ensure other municipalities around the lake are aware of this issue and to take a strong stand to make sure the proper studies are done.
So the highway is not going to be operational in another 7, 8, 10 years. And we have no idea how much environment problem going to get worse. And then on top of that, we might have pollutants coming into the Simcoe Lake. So I want to tie this topic with of course opening of the green belt. But recently, I think last week, judge ruled in favor of Montana youth. I don't know if you heard the news.
Yep.
Landmark climate case in which they said the court said the young people have a constitutional right to a healthful environment, and the state must consider potential climate damage.
Yep.
So this ruling is called as as a game changer, at least in the US, and we have seen what the Superior Court of Ontario has done in Waterloo when they stopped the evacuation of encampments.
Yep.
So do you hope that the courts in Ontario and in Canada take the similar stand when it comes to Bradford Highway, as well as the opening of the green belt in Ontario?
That's a big question. I think I'll try and answer it the best I can. I think one thing's important to know is that we had 7 Ontarian youth, including Indigenous youth, lead the charge against the province for not having a climate plan. So people don't realize that the province doesn't have a climate plan that's finalized that actually addresses climate. They talk a lot about climate, but they don't have targets. They don't have mechanisms in place to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And in fact, I would say most of their policies over this term and their previous term has done nothing but to exacerbate climate emissions, whether that be the type of housing that they're promoting, the reduction of protections for wetlands and for forests, which we know are carbon sinks, their proliferation of highways. They've really become kind of a climate laggard. So 7 youth did, with the help of EcoJustice, did take the province to court. Unfortunately, their suit was thrown out, but it's under appeal. And they were basing it on intergenerational discrimination that current, the youth of today are going to be facing the most amount of impacts, and that would go against their charter rights and freedoms. So to get back to what do I expect the feds and the province to do, I mean, I would think that they should be doing their due diligence, especially at the federal level, that continues to talk about being climate leaders. They didn't get involved in the Bradford Bypass, even though we asked them to. They don't have good reasoning for it. And in fact, a judge found that they didn't have good reasons to not get involved in the Bradford Bypass and asked them to reconsider why they didn't consider the cumulative impacts for the greenhouse gas emissions that are going to come, the loading of salt and pollution to Lake Simcoe, the threat to endangered species. So as far as the next part of the question was about the green belt and the Auditor General report. And I think the feds have a role to play in protecting land and protecting waters across Simcoe County and the country. Unfortunately, Canada sometimes becomes, well, that's not my job, that's your job, right? No, that's not my jurisdiction, that's your jurisdiction. And I think if anything's going to become a problem with that, it's that feeling of, I don't want to step on your toes, province, even though we very clearly know that they're not, the province is not leading the way that they should be. And in fact, they're dragging us backwards to the 1990s, or even earlier in some cases. The Auditor General report found very clearly that it was a biased process that gave preferential treatment to a few developers, that environmental conditions and concerns were overlooked if it in any way, shape, or form threatened the outcome of what they wanted, the parcels of land that they wanted to remove. If that was going to be a threat because of environmental conditions, those were just simply removed. And it was a very political process with very little evidence. And I think where that overlaps with the bypass is pretty much we've seen the same thing. We have a golf course that was in the way of the bypass, and ended up it got rerouted around the edges of the golf course, and it also ended up be the golf course that's owned by the MPP Stan Cho. So in the process of rerouting around a private golf course, they have driven it right into the heart of homes in an ancient archaeological site. So it feels very much like a lot of the process that have been undertaken by the province have come from a very high political level with a very stated outcome, and you bend everything else to the will of what the outcome is, not having it informed by evidence or by science or by data. Rather, this is what we want. How do you bend the rules and break the rules to make that outcome be the case? And that's not the way that government should be handling issues. And that's what we would call a corrupt government, a government that sees the outcome first, that especially when you're starting talking about enriching a few at the cost of many, and does not care what the evidence and the data has to say about why you should think about it a different way, or why you should neglect a project or put a project on the shelf. They want the outcome, come what may, and they're going to change, cut, slash, defund, whatever they have to do to get what they want is what they're going to do. And I don't think that's any way indicative of a government for the people.
Yeah, and it's interesting, whenever I, as a reporter, ask, police or politicians questions about these kind of issues, oftentimes I get a response, this is Canada. And what they try to tell me that, you come from India, this is, Western civilization, Western democracy, we are very fair. So I hear that a lot, and, and even after the all this, very open billions of dollars in benefits, I don't think the provincial government had even announced that they are going to reconsider, or what are they going to do. They just, I think he's just Premier Ford said, I take the responsibility, but then as if it has already been, trees has already been cut and building has already been built, and there is nothing that they can do. Is there any action plan proposed by the government?
Well, yes and no. And first, I just want to say, I'm sorry that that's the response that you get when you try to point out that there is a bias or corruption or issues within our own democracy. And I think our unwillingness to look at it and finger point from a place of, well, it's not like that, we're not like that, it is such a dishonest and unfortunate response, because it first off comes very haughty of like, oh, well, we're better, the superiority, which is not the case. Canada, I don't think people realize environmentally how much of a laggard Canada is. We are the biggest water waster. We produce the most garbage. We cut down most of the old growth forests in the world. Like, these are global stats. So the idea that we're somehow at the environmental top of the game and our democracy is at the top of its game is just a way to avoid the reality, which is we have allowed, in particular, what's been shown with this Auditor General report, we have allowed our democracy to wither, because we would rather point out how other countries, well, at least we're not like the States, at least we don't have this. And it really does a disservice to kind of keeping our democracy honest and moving forward and progressing. And I think you can see that. I will just wanted to point that out. It's a pretty pathetic response, and I don't think anybody should be answering that way. But to your question, what is their action plan? The Auditor General put out 14 recommendations, and as it is with all Auditor General reports, the province has an option of taking the recommendations or not taking the recommendations. A lot of the recommendations flowed around fixing the process so it would have less political and undue influence from private sector. But the 15th recommendation was that considering the process was so biased, and she actually said in her press conference that this was so biased and so political and so much preferential treatment was given, she didn't even want to call it a process, because a process would assume there was some order and there was some reasoning to it and some oversight. She was calling it an exercise. She said, I will not call it a process. It was an exercise. So the 15th recommendation was that considering this exercise was so biased and gave such a undue influence to private interests, that they should reconsider the Greenbelt takeouts. And the province, that is the only one that they refuse to satisfy. So you have an independent officer of the legislature who is not partisan in any way, and she has taken other previous governments to task, has said, you have a corrupt process here and your outcome is not good and you should look at this. They have been caught red-handed with their hand in the cookie jar, and they refuse to reconsider in any way, shape, or form the decisions that have been made. It's not too late to have the lands returned. And in fact, they keep going off about how, if they don't meet these targets, we're going to return the land to the Greenbelt. That's just a talking point. There is no policy in place right now that shows how those lands would get replaced or what kind of thresholds they have to meet for the land to be replaced. There is nothing official and any sort of policy or language that guarantees that would be the outcome. They're just using it as a diversion and talking point.
Okay, so if you have time, just one last question about
Sure.
what the residents of Barrie, Simcoe County, especially youth, can do regarding environmental causes, especially the Bradford Bypass, which has completed 0%, and the Greenbelt, which is still in place. What they can do?
I think the first thing is people have to recognize that we are past the time of individual actions of making sure you recycle the best and compost the best as being enough to counter environmental issues. We are past the point of individual action, and we are fully firmly into collective action. Means that not only should you not feel guilt if you can't figure out how to solve these problems on your own, because you're talking now about the rot in democracy. You're talking about systems and processes that one person can't have influence over, at least a normal, regular citizen. So they have to recognize that it's going to be done by a community, not by an individual. So I would say first, start to connect with groups in your area that are already doing this kind of work. I mean, the Simcoe County Greenbelt Coalition is connected with roughly 50 organizations across Simcoe County who are doing the work on the ground. We support them, they support us. We all work together at trying to build a better, stronger, healthier community. We're hosting a public forum on September 12th at Grace United Church in the evening. We're going to have special guest Tim Gray from Environmental Defense and former mayor of Toronto and former chair of the Greenbelt Council, David Crombie, there, because we think that the province should be having these discussions. If you found out your representative, and let's keep in mind for these Greenbelt takeouts, it was an act of cabinet, meaning 30 cabinet ministers signed off and approved on the Greenbelt being chopped up. It wasn't just an act of Doug Ford, it was an act of cabinet, meaning that we have 3 cabinet ministers in Simcoe County that also approved of this biased process. So we think if you're living in a strong democracy, in a transparent and honest democracy, that now is not the time to hide behind, a scapegoat. You should be facing public scrutiny and public questions. So not only are we organizing rallies, but we think these types of conversations need to be held in public forums where people can voice their opinions, ask questions, and get the information that they deserve. We have invited the cabinet ministers that are in Simcoe County. And so if people want to, we're not sure if they're going to show, but at the very least, we'll have other speakers, myself included, there that will be answering questions, listening to comments, to have a public forum on this. So those are the kind of things to get involved, to connect with the community, to connect with people that care about what you care about, and to not assume that when you write one letter, everything's going to change. It's about lots of people writing letters. And so I would suggest write a letter to your paper, talk to your neighbors. You have a network, collective actions where you need to turn it. So start getting organized with other people in your church, in your community, in your workplace, soccer clubs, whatever it has to be. I mean, if we really want our democracy to stay strong or get stronger, then we have to root out this kind of rot. And right now they're trying to get away with it. So we need to really step up.
Thank you so much, Margaret, for your time, and
Yep.
I appreciate that.
Yeah. Thanks, Deepak. Nice talking to you again.
Yeah.